Also, I'll be using an app as my timer. So once the time is up, it's gonna go ding. Alright?
Cool.
Yeah.
We have grace period at this tournament, though, right?
Protected time, we don't.
Oh, and
No,
there's
like
a
grace
30
period,
second
like
grace period.
just to finish your sentence after the
Oh
time.
yeah, of course. Yeah. I'm
Okay.
not gonna be like, get out. You know?
Okay. Get off the stand.
Alright, ready when you're ready.
Okay. Opponents ready?
Yep.
Perfect. Starting time now. We affirm resolved the U.S. should cease all military operations in South China Sea. We're going to find cease all military operations as to completely halt all active military surveillances outside U.S. territory, and South China Sea as geographical location. So with the framers' intent of this resolution, it's going to be referring to the escalating conflict in that area that is south of China and in between Vietnam and the Philippines. So
Point of
again,
clarification,
what?
is that definition just for surveillance or all military operations in general?
That's for South China Sea. So the geographical
surveillance.
location. The surveillance one?
Yeah.
That is under cease all military operations. So we're completely halting all active military surveillances outside of the U.S. and like military actions outside U.S. territories. So the weighing mechanism of today's debate is going to be cost-benefit analysis and our value stability as that is the most inherent value in today's round concerning this international relations topic. So now on to our plan text. This is just going to be the resolution in a time frame as soon as viably possible within reason. So we're not going to want to rush anything, but we're not going to put necessarily a cap on it. So as viably possible, that's going to be when this is going to be instated, just the resolution as our plan text. So now to our first contention of military and political escalation. So currently in the status quo with Trump as president, he has sent in more military action within his realm of presidency. So we are seeing drones and planes flying over Chinese waters. We are seeing him putting in warships in the South China Sea. According to a 2018 Politico article, China has not been backing down when seeing this. They say, okay, yes, we see this is happening, and they're ready to step up and actually meet U.S. in this military and political escalation tactic. China's being very vocal about the fact that they want them out of the South China Sea. So what this does here is we're seeing a harm, and what the harm is that China is willing to shoot down or react back to this U.S. escalation within the South China Sea. And we see this in the Politico 2018 article. We see that they've recently been testing and deploying surface-to-air missiles. This is really in correlation to the air flights and the air tests that the U.S. has been flying over the South China Sea. So we can see that that is a reactionary thing that China is doing towards the U.S. escalation of military. Yes?
Point of information, just as a matter of principle, why should we do something just because China wants us to?
It's the fact, I'll get in more into the solvency of the impacts, but it's going to actually hurt the stability of not only the region, but also the U.S. and the globe as a whole, which I'll explain in this contention and the next. So what this is doing is that we see this is escalating in which China is going to react, and we see that it's escalating to actual harmed conflict and physical conflict instead of just verbal or diplomatic conflict. So the solvency here is if the U.S. gets out and ceases this military action, we can see that the U.S. can actually make a case for international dialogue. We see this through an example of the U.S. being a hindrance towards international dialogue for solving problems. An example would be in Cuba, for example. The U.S. essentially delayed the process for international peace with Cuba because of the fact that the U.S. was so bent on being in that sphere of influence within Cuba. So what we see here is that the international community can actually provide more solvency with all the powers that the UN, for example, has if the U.S. steps out and de-escalates this conflict. We see, yes?
Just out of curiosity, when was the last time China actually listened to the UN?
Listen to the UN? I don't know, they participate in the UN. You can see that in the North Korea, South Korea diplomatic talks with denuclearization. They participated in that. So we see that what the U.S. does is it has a tit for tat type of thing. If it's in the international community looks at the U.S. as, oh, if you're in there, then you're solving the problem. But what the U.S. is actually doing is escalating the problem, as we saw early in this contention. So what we see is if we take the U.S. out, the international community actually has a chance to solve this problem without feeling like, oh, we have a big five in the area, they can solve it by themselves. So ultimately what we're seeing here is that the international community can solve this better with the U.S. out in de-escalating this. So the impact here is we're going to see a de-escalation of this conflict, which does a couple things. First, it avoids the harm of human life, both in China and the other surrounding countries like Vietnam, Philippines, and things like that, so we don't have to go to physical conflict. Second, we see that we can decrease the military funding towards this. This essentially is being like a drain on the U.S. military funding, when instead it could be appropriated towards things such as infrastructure, education, and domestic things, or other foreign affairs that are more helpful for U.S. interests and global interests in the long run. So we see that that's a better use of military money or U.S. budget money. And then next, it also allows for the international community to solve, so China can simmer down and we can actually de-escalate this conflict instead of launching ourselves into a possible physical manifestation. So now to our second contention of economics. So in the status quo, the U.S. is being harmed with the trade war because of Donald Trump's tariffs. That is continued and essentially fueled by this South China Sea conflict. So the harm here is that this goes back on the American people. When we have these tariffs, we see that eventually the American people have to pay for it in the end. An example of this is washer and dryers. The tariff on aluminum that Trump essentially instated on China doubled the prices of washer and dryers for American buyers. So what this does is it only hurts American customers and American buyers in the long run because of this tariff, because they have to pay for it somewhere. Yes?
Considering that the tariff on aluminum and steel was not only on China, but also on the UK, Canada, France, and many of our allies, how exactly is this unique in any way to the affirmative?
Because China is the main supplier of this. This is where America gets the majority of their supply of aluminum and steel. Continuing on, what we see is that somehow with these tariffs, they're going to have to be paid, and it's going to be paid by the people. What we see is this also hurts the global economy because of different countries such as like Vietnam, Philippines that rely on the U.S. economy. If the U.S. economy is hurt by this trade war and by this conflict with China, those economies are going to be hurt as well because of their dependency on the U.S. economy. So what we're seeing here is that we actually see like a really large impact and a really large harm for all global economies. The solve here is that we're seeing that if we get out, it de-escalates and it allows China to essentially like calms down the fuel that adds to these trade wars, which we see. So the impact here is that we're seeing a CNN 2019 article states, I'm sorry, I don't have time, that essentially this can prevent further collapse because it cuts out the quickest way of escalation. So if we cut the root of escalation right from the bud, then we can prevent all these things happening to the U.S. economy and the global economy that depends on the U.S. and the people within the U.S. And it also shows us as a better international actor because we're a dependent nation. So for all of them more, I urge a strong vote in the affirmation.
Yeah.
Can I know? They might fall.
Alright, 8-minute LL. Everyone's ready? Judges ready?
Off case, are you going on case, off case, first off time?
It's pretty much just going to be the opposition case and then
Okay, cool.
the case. 8 minutes, starting now. We largely agree with most of the definitions given by the Prime Minister's speech, but more importantly, on the seize all definition, we would also like to go and say that within this context, we're also removing all of our forces from the region. For example, our aircraft battle groups, those are also going to be removed from the South China Sea region. Second of all, we also define military operations as being conducted by the United States military, and we define the United States as being as the United States government, as the United States government is the only institution with any authority to control any military operations. Now, the framework for this entire round is going to be one of benefiting the United States. Moreover, since the act on the resolution is going to be the United States government has a first and foremost obligation to its own people as per its constituent purpose, which means that whichever side best shows that we're best benefiting the United States people overall is going to be the winner of this round. Now, also, as an overriding observation on the round, the burden of the government in this side is to show why seizing all military operations uniquely is going to be key for their impacts. Insofar as they don't actually show that, that's not a reason to be voting for the government side. Now, onto the main contentions. Contention 1 for the opposition case is going to be keeping sea lanes open. A few main reasons why. First of all, China is actively building islands and building military bases in the region right now, which means that they actually want to go and exert more control over this region. If the United States is not being involved in this region, well then China will get their way. But second of all, China has clearly made their intentions clear. They want to control this area. They've already made this clear through their 9-to-1 declaration, and they clearly want to go and do so through state propaganda. But apparently you disagree.
Are there other international actors that can do this better, or other international actors that can be in this?
Well, the last time that I checked, China was literally the only one who was building islands, and the United States was literally the only one that cared. We're the only ones who insofar as sending aircraft battle groups in the region, and that's more than enough reason as to why the United States is going to be uniquely key in this region. But moreover, the United States presence is going to be uniquely key to making sure that China cannot control these islands, since, as I said before, we're literally the only ones who are actually even sending any forces to the region, which means that if we pull out, nobody else is going to be doing anything to go and do, well, is going to be doing anything against China in the region. But apparently you disagree as well.
If China and the U.S. are the only people that care, why is it important that the U.S. stay if nobody else cares about this global
No,
conflict?
what I'm saying right now is that nobody else is actually going to be putting forces into the region if the United States pulls out. If the United States pulls out, well, then nobody else will be able to stand against China, both in terms of their forces and, in terms of their political stability. Now, there are a few main impacts to this point. First of all, it's going to be keeping the global economy afloat. A massive amount of trade flows through this region. Insofar as China is able to go exert more and more pressure on this region, that means that they're able to go and exert their own policies over it, which means it's going to be worse for the economy overall. It's always going to be better for this to be international waters for more and more economies to go and keep the economy more and more efficient. But second of all, it's going to give China leeway to go and do whatever they want to go and undermine the United States elsewhere. Because insofar as China is able to lock down this region, they're able to protect their national security even more, which is going to make them more and more likely and more able to go and contest the United States elsewhere. For example, one of China's most major weaknesses is that their economy is largely dependent on exports and international trade. Insofar as they're unable to protect this region, and insofar as they're able to go and exert more and more control over this region, they're able to lock down that front and they're able to contest the United States more elsewhere, which is always going to be worse for the United States people. Now, contention 2 is going to be the issue of disaster relief. The United States presence is going to be uniquely key in this region because it allows us to go and actually help our allies in the region. Remember that in this region there are many different underdeveloped countries that actually need the United States disaster relief, and the way that in which we go and do that is by making sure that our forces are in the region and able to go and respond quickly to these disasters. If the United States presence is not in these regions, it's going to take much longer for us to go and get to these other places, to go and help these places that are affected by disasters or our allies. But apparently you disagree as well.
Why is this presence uniquely military? Like, why do military people have to be there to do disaster relief?
Well, the reason why is because the United States military is one of the best funded institutions in history. Insofar as the United States military is not going to be there, that means that these other organizations are, well, with lesser funds, are not going to be there as quickly. But contention 3 is going to be checking the hegemony of China, because if China is able to go and control this region, that means that they're able to go and put pressure on nearby economies, such as, say, Japan, who are our allies. They're able to selectively use their policies to disadvantage people who align with the United States and advantage people who align with them. This is always going to be reducing the United States influence in the region, which is always going to be worse for United States policymakers and by extension the United States people overall. But contention 4 is going to be the issue of international law. There are 3 main reasons as to why this is going to be one of the most key impacts for the negative in this round. First of all, is that the president is going to be destroying the freedom of navigation rights, because insofar as this is one of the biggest issues in the freedom of navigation so far, that means that it's going to be allowing incentivizing other nations to go and contest international waters within the regions as well, which is always going to be worse overall because it leads towards more probability of conflict and more probability that these international waters will be nationalized. And second of all, it's going to be reducing the United States ally credibility, because if we pull out right now and we concede to China, that's simply going to make our allies think that we are not credible that we are not a credible ally, and they're simply going to be moving away from the United States. This means a few main things. First of all, they're more and more likely to drift away from the United States. That's always going to be worse for the American people. But second of all, they're more and more likely to do things like nuclear proliferation because they think that they can no longer count on the United States. But third and finally is that it incentivizes China to go up against the United States elsewhere. Because insofar as we back down now in this conflict, that simply means that China is more likely to, simply thinks that escalation is a valuable means of going against the United States, which means that they're more likely to go and do it elsewhere, not less. Now, on to the Prime Minister's speech. First of all, on the value of stability, stability is not going to be the most important value in this round. I agree that we should be doing this by a cost-benefit analysis on their impact on the American people, but stability is not necessarily the reason to go and do that. Case in point, look towards World War II. Chamberlain conceded large parts of Europe and large amounts of influence to Hitler just prior to World War II on the name of stability. He said, peace in our time. And what did that lead towards? Millions of people dying and Hitler rising to power. The fact of the matter is that stability is not always the best impact. In fact, it can lead towards much worse things overall. We should be taking a larger stance and not necessarily always looking for stability. Now, as an overview to the entirety of the Prime Minister's speech, remember the observation of the opposition case. The only way as how the government can drive any offense under this resolution is if they show that all of these are uniquely specific towards withdrawing all U.S. military presence in the region. Insofar as they're unable to show that, that's not a reason to vote for the government. That's simply a reason to go and withdraw some of the forces, but not all of them overall, which means that they're not upholding the resolution. Now, on contention 1 of escalation, first of all, they talk about Trump escalating our forces in the region more and more, and China doing it to match. But you can turn this against against them because it simply means more and more perverse incentives for China to go and escalate other conflicts elsewhere, simply crossed by the relevant arguments of the opposition case. Insofar as we're withdrawing right now, when China escalates a situation, that simply means that they're more likely to escalate things elsewhere, which means more probability of conflict and more probability of more deaths later on. But second of all, this entire point is simply non-unique, because insofar as China is going to be building these bases anyway, that simply shows that they want to go and escalate these conflicts, regardless of what the United States does right now. It's important that we stand up against them and make sure that they don't want to do this in the future. Now, they also say that the United States presence is being a hindrance towards international negotiations, but you can actually turn this against them, because U.S. presence is actually a major one of our ability to go and negotiate with China in the first place, because it actually gives us chips on the board. Insofar as the United States presence is not going to be in the region and there is no other viable alternative, that simply means that we have no chips on the board, we have no ability to negotiate with China. And then they talk about how that they will cooperate, and then they give this example of them cooperating in North Korean and South Korean negotiations. But remember that you can actually turn this example against them, because China has consistently violated our agreements with them to go and constrain North Korea. That's reason enough as to show you why China will not cooperate in these negotiations. We have to go and show force against them instead to go and make sure that they will actually cooperate in the future. And this is simply non-unique. China is on the UN Security Council, which means that they wouldn't listen to the UN anyway. Now, on contention 2 of the trade war, really quickly, 3 main responses. First of all, we can actually turn this against them because the trade war is actually key to protecting the United States' intellectual property and its ability to go and access the Chinese market. But second of all, this is actually going to be non-unique because Trump is going to be doing this kind of stuff anyway, because it doesn't matter what China is doing in the South China Sea, because Trump ran on this, he's going to keep on doing it regardless. And third and finally, regardless of what happens in future elections, it's simply non-unique because both parties want to go up against China and they want to go and pursue this trade war regardless against China to go and make sure to go and bring more benefits for the American people, which means that all these impacts are non-unique. There is absolutely no reason to be voting for the government under this resolution. For these reasons, I urge a opposition ballot.
Off time, I am going to be talking about why you should not buy the negation as viable for a specific off-chance reason, and then I'm going to go into AF and then neg. Actually, neg then AF. Alright, everybody ready? Starting time now. So the first problem in this round is the negation. In the last 2 minutes of the speech, I was standing ready to ask a question. That important question is notes. There have been absolutely no sources on the negation side to actually prove this. What the negation has done is they've made a lot of claims. Specifically, they've claimed that China will escalate, problems will get worse, disaster relief won't be able to go through. They've not provided a single source. In California Parley, it's extremely important that you have a separate sheet of notes that you can actually prove is viable. We have a separate sheet of notes that is available to our opponents at any time if they want to use it. That's extremely important because what that proves is that you're actually talking about resource material that will happen. It shows that when you give examples, they're viable to the real world. The problem with the negation is that they can't prove that anything's happening, specifically not just with a lack of evidence, but with a lack of links. So, onto their case. Lack of links. First, they talk about how China's doting control. No evidence, again. They talk about how no one else can handle China. No evidence, again. But there's also no link. How can no one else handle China? Why is the U.S. the only international actor that can intervene here? They say that the U.S. is the only international actor who is intervening. They don't say that the U.S. is the only international actor that can intervene, and they provide no reason why. Why is there no one else in the entire world who can do this? The U.S. is proven to be the most immoral actor when dealing with international conflict. And when we talked about this, they didn't respond, which I'll get to on in our case. But this is extremely important because what it proves is, A, the U.S. is a bad international actor. It makes bad decisions, especially when they're only vying for their own stability and their own relations. They make bad choices on behalf of the world stage that cause collapse. But also, when you deal with these issues, what you see is that there's actually no links to prove that collapse will happen if the U.S. pulls out. Yes?
That's actually a great question. But the thing is, what other international actors are currently taking the place of the United States in the region?
What I'm saying is that there doesn't need to be someone currently there. There needs to be a viable alternative which can take place. So current intervention doesn't matter. What matters is that there could be someone in that placement. That's the important thing. Because what you claim is that there's no alternative actor to the US. So what that means is that the US is the only person who can step in, and there are other viable international actors that can deal better with foreign policy. Specifically, they talk about how this slippery slope of undermining the U.S., everyone undermines the U.S. under Trump. It's actually a very common thing that happens all the time. Other countries have no respect for the U.S. on the international stage whatsoever. The US has been leaving their security deals, they've been leaving the treaties that they signed, and they haven't been giving any regard to the international community. So this slippery slope of undermining the US, it's already been happening for 2 years, and we haven't seen any drastic impacts yet. And the negation provides no evidence or no uniqueness on why we'd see any international drastic slippery slope of undermining the US. Our allies already don't trust us, and that hasn't proven to be a problem yet. And it's been 2, 3, 4 years. Obama didn't care about our allies, and even then we saw nothing negative happen, because people still want to do business with the US, because we're a giant economic actor. It doesn't matter if we stick to our word, it matters that we have power, and our power comes from our economic stage. That's the important thing that people care about. And their also on the first contention, there are no impacts that are viable here under the negation. So there's no reason that we should buy any of this, because they actually haven't impacted it to mean anything on the world stage. In contention 2, they talk about disaster relief. Here's where evidence comes into play. There's no reason why commonalities prove that you can get disaster relief to other countries when they are in difficult situations. We do it all the time. Take, for example, even a commercial air flight. You can still fly over the South China Sea, or you can fly around it. It doesn't matter. You can still get aid to different places. They provided no unique reason on why this is a giant block. Also, we provided the regions in which the South China Sea would actually be taking power. We still have strong allyships within Vietnam and the Philippines, meaning that we can still go into their surrounding seas and areas. And in the case of disaster relief, commonly those area boundaries and sea territories are non-viable because it's in the name of relief. So if we're trying to get someone relief because China is taking control of them, there are tons of viable routes and alternatives, especially because of our placement in South Korea. Which again, let's talk about this. The negation says that that the US will lose all power in the region, and that's simply not true. What we're advocating for is that they stop patrolling in the South China Sea. We're not saying that we pull out of all of our military bases, of which the US has over 500, according to Politico 2018, but also that we're just saying that we're stop patrolling in the South China Sea. We're not going to be the people provoking. We hold military prisons. We're just not provoking. And when we say cease all military intervention, we are removing active forces, but there are benign forces in US territory that can remain in other countries. So, especially when we're talking about South Korea and like power in the region, the US still holds a significant stake in the region. South Korea is one of the largest military bases that the US actually has, and we're not just going to be leaving that, so we still would have significant power in that region. On the third contention, asking at the 7-minute mark if I have time. On the second contention, 7-minute mark if I have time. Third contention on like destroys freedom, navigation rights, ally credibility. I've already kind of touched on this, but the US doesn't have any credibility, and it doesn't matter. And there's no reason why it should be poignant at this point, because the negation has not only provided no evidence, no impacts, but no links here. They just say that we're not credible so that our allies are going to trust us and they're going to need nukes. In what situation would that happen? Not only do large actors already have nukes in most countries, but what small countries are going to go, the US isn't protecting me, better get nukes, because most of these treaties already have other larger countries that are way more valuable on their word to actually sticking to that will protect those countries. So not only will this not happen, but there's no links to actually prove that it's viable. On our case, specifically on the definitions of removing all forces, this is simply, we're going to be removing all active forces that are patrolling in the area and causing conflict, which is the important thing to touch on here. The other definitions we agree on the value of stability with World War II. Honestly, this example doesn't make a ton of sense, because when a country acts within its own interest for stability, that's where the issue arises, and that's the problem with the World War II example, because it exactly proves that. When we talk about benefiting the US through a cost-benefit analysis lens, and when we look at benefiting the US through stability, what we see is that the US only cares about itself and makes poor international choices, as we've proven and haven't been responded to. Specifically, on the first contention, we talked about political escalation. They talked about how there's like no uniqueness. The uniqueness here is that basically what's happening in the South China Sea is that there's like a ton of conflict, and China keeps saying that they're going to shoot Americans down. If we stay in the region, the likelihood that something will happen is extremely high. The thing is, if we leave, we allow for other actors to actually take place, which we've proven multiple times. I don't have time, I'm sorry. So the issues here are basically like the harms. So what happens in the area is if we stay, there will be fighting, there will be physical conflict. And what we see is physical conflict will escalate into more physical content and instability throughout the region, as we've proved, and hasn't been responded to in any of the examples or the surrounding links. So in the solves, the only thing that was responded to is in North and South Korea, China doesn't stick to their word. The that doesn't matter because North and South Korea was not an economic problem for them. Once it becomes economic for China, as we've proven, they will act. And if the U.S. leaves and if the U.S. doesn't leave and more conflict happens, it becomes economic, and that becomes a problem for China. Under the impacts of like less strain on funds, they never responded to any of the impacts, and the only response on the second contention was basically like there's going to be like elections. This is not unique, and they talked about other parties. They didn't elaborate. They didn't prove. The second contention should flow through because all other parties on the Democratic and most on the Republican side have said that they're going to be removing Trump's tariffs. So for all those reasons and more, please vote in favor of the affirmation. Thank you.
If everyone's ready, the order is going to be first addressing the a priori issue brought up in the affirmative, then going on to the definition and framing arguments, then down the negative speech defending our position, and then onto the affirmative, onto the government rather. Is everyone ready? 8 minutes begins now. Let's start with the a priori the government brings up, where they say that just because we don't like read any source or provide this sheet of notes, we shouldn't consider any of our arguments. However, a couple problems here. First of all, look to common knowledge and reasonability when considering the arguments in this round. If something falls into the domain of common knowledge, something that we all like accept to be true, if you're reading like any sort of news or keeping up with the times or not living under a rock, you're gonna know these things are true, then accept those on the flow. But second of all, it is to confine us to like these pre-round note sheets is bad for the educational value of debate because it essentially like questions it essentially constrains what we can do in a debate round to just what we've written down on a note sheet. In fact, even if you look at the negative arguments, they really only brought up like one study from CNN. They're not citing these like studies with every single argument they make. Actually, that would be like a reverse voting issue if you're gonna vote against the neg because they're not bringing up these issues either. They did like one CNN article. That's gonna be big in this round because insofar as we're valuing the educational value of this round, we should be able to like reach any corner of our knowledge and pull things from the common knowledge and reasonability domain. But apparently you disagree.
Question? First thing, you can have this if you want it. And second, on your case, when you're talking about like common knowledge and things like that, your second and third contentions talk about disaster relief, navigation rights that aren't common knowledge, and you don't expand on them through the use of evidence. So how can we actually buy them?
Well, I would say that case studies that we bring up, especially when they're as specific as we're going to bring up and we have brought up, should carry through in the round. But next, let's address this idea of this definition of what it means to cease all operations. The government side seems to be under the idea that we can still leave our bases and a lot of like passive troops in the region. We just want to clarify that any operations means that active personnel that are keeping these bases running are going to be pulled out. So even if we don't like destroy the base altogether, insofar as we're pulling out these personnel, the bases are going to become defunct, and it's as though we have no military like influence or any sort of hegemony in the region. That is the plan that the government is defending. But next, onto this value of like U.S. first. They talk about stability and how like stability fails only because we're putting like our interests first. However, recognize that insofar as the resolution doesn't use like the vague this house, it specifically talks about the U.S. should implies a moral obligation, and since any government has a moral obligation first to its own people and then everybody else, we're going to be considering U.S. benefits first and then a more general cost-benefit analysis. But apparently you disagree.
You talked about providing more case studies and new evidence. Are you going to be citing any of this? How are we supposed to argue this because we don't have any new arguments to make on our side?
It's not a new argument. We're just saying like if we need to back up other things with examples, we're allowed to do that in this speech. It's not the final speech. Now let's go on to the first contention. And really the response they make here is the entire thesis of their offense. And they're saying, the government side is saying, why is there nobody else in the world who can intervene? Why is there nobody else in the world who will intervene? The entire premise of the government case relies on the fact that somebody is going to replace the U.S. when we pull out. However, this fails for a couple reasons. First, the U.S. is the largest military in the world and has more military budget than the next 7 countries combined. That's going to be huge because insofar as China and Russia are second and third place, no other country even comes close to matching the U.S. But second, when we talk about international actors, recognize that the majority of international resources come from none other than the U.S. The U.S. is pulling out the military, but insofar as we control most of the international resources, by pulling out our own operations, there is no solvency or no any like other bright line to suggest that the U.S. would send in these international operations. Third, even if they do, they're not going to be enough. UN peacekeeping troops are especially like super small compared to like our own force in the region. And fourth, even if you want to buy that somebody else will fill in eventually, insofar as what their plan says as soon as reasonably possible, while we're waiting for somebody else to fill in. If they ever do fill in, the world is going to be hurting for it. So at that point, you drop them right there. But now, they talk about how like everyone undermines the U.S. because of Trump, but we don't see any drastic impacts coming off of this. But this is exactly why we must stay in. Even if in the age of Trump, other countries don't respect the U.S. for who we are as a country, they respect us for our military. You pull out the military, you pull out the last bit of leverage we have. Then we can wait till 2020 and see what other president we have. But insofar as the government side is defending the fact that we're pulling out right now in the status quo in the age of Trump, that's going to be especially bad. But then they talk about how the allies already don't trust the U.S. I would say that there's a big difference between military trust and economic trust. Yes, they may still be trading with us because they trust our economy, but they do not trust our military. Look to South Korea, for example, which has doubted our security guarantee, and because of that is actually pursuing nuclear weapons. That's going to be huge. Insofar as that's a very clear example of how our allies are doubting our security guarantee, our military trust, and starting to nuclear proliferate. And as we finally, as more and more countries get nukes, that probability of war is going to increase, and the tensions they talk about and the war they talk about is actually going to increase in the government world. But now on to the second contention about disaster relief. So they say that there's other ways of supplying disaster relief that don't rely on the military. However, I would say that when it comes to disaster relief, when we're looking at things in a cost-benefit analysis, any amount of disaster relief is better. The more disaster relief we have, the better. And insofar as the U.S. military is at least like 10 times more funded, like look at our $700 billion budget, as opposed to like the American Red Cross, we're going to be able to supply a lot more disaster relief from the military than from any other like non-governmental organization, and the UN isn't even able to match our contributions. But you disagree?
If the world is doubting the U.S., then why are they the uniquely best actor to be in this situation?
So we're saying that they may not be the best, but they're the only actor to be in this situation. Like you're trying to dream up some world where like we superpower France or Canada to U.S. power and they can intervene. But the fact of the matter is, no matter how much we want Justin Trudeau to be the guy in charge of the South China Sea, he simply doesn't have the capability to do so. Insofar as like no other actor can replace the U.S., we have to look at the U.S. or nobody at all. And at that point, we're going to find that the U.S. is better than nobody at all. The third contention, basically, like you can cross-apply the response that I made to the first, like defending the first contention, and clean extend that across the globe. Insofar as China's going to take control of the South China Sea, that's going to set a terrible precedent for our politics in the region, as well as the other countries' fate in that region. But next, on the contention 4 about ILAW, they talk about how like, the U.S. has no credibility right now. I've already explained the difference between economic and military credibility, and then they talk about how like, we need an example of how we're reducing this allied credibility. I've already given you the example of South Korea, which is literally nuclearizing in the status quo because of the U.S. Pulling out of the region more and more. They're starting to doubt our security guarantee. They say that other like smaller countries have other big countries that they can rely on, but the only two other big countries are China and Russia. I've already proven to you why those are not going to be like viable, and there's no other like big democratic countries that they can rely on as much as the U.S. But now onto the Prime Minister's speech. First of all, I've already addressed most of the framing and definition impacts. You can extend all of that clean across the flow. On their first contention about this military and political escalation, they just say that, like, they try to extend their impacts of how when we stay, the likelihood of conflict is high. But remember, first of all, there's no specificity for how much Trump has increased the involvement in the region. Insofar as they don't provide any specificity for how much Trump is involved in the region, there's no reason to pull out now. They don't provide why explicitly right now the conflict is about to boil over. At that point, their plan is bad because their plan says we should do this ASAP. But next, they talk about like how China will escalate to physical conflict. But they don't provide any warrant or example. Building missile defenses is not a sign of being ready for war. We've had like missile defenses for decades, but we haven't had nuclear war. But next, they talk about like how China will listen to the UN. They'll be like UN operations and like negotiations and stuff. But insofar as even the one example that they cite where like China talked about denuclearization, China hasn't denuclearized. That clearly shows how they're not listening to the UN. That's actually going to be a turn insofar as they're not listening to the UN. And next, they bring this example of how like somebody else should fill in. You can explain all the 4 impacts I've given to you on why nobody else can and will fill in. The debate comes down to whether we want the US in the region or nobody at all, and I think that's a pretty clear opposition ballot. And really quick, on their last contention about this economics, really briefly. First of all, they say that this trade war is fueled by the South China Sea conflict. But first of all, we were involved in the South China Sea before Trump and before the trade war, and there was no trade war. But second of all, the tariffs only happened because of Trump's economic policy, not his military policy. We've seen that before Trump's economic policy, China was totally chill with trading with us. And lastly, China's economy is always very dependent on ours, so all their impacts are short-term at best. China will yield in the end. For those reasons, I urge an opposition ballot.
Alright, so leader of the opposition rebuttal, the order is just going to be the 3 main voting issues for the opposition case. I'll signpost as I go through. Alright, 3 minutes, starting now. Oh,
4 minutes.
4 minutes.
alright. 4 minutes, judges ready? Opponents ready? 4 minutes, starting now. The first reason as why you ultimately vote for the opposition side is going to be the observation coming off the leader of the opposition case, which never went responded to throughout the entire round. Remember that the burden of the government side in this round is to prove that that the United States should withdraw all military presence from this region. They haven't given you a single reason as why the entirety of the government's case is actually unique to to us pulling out all military presence in the region. This is going to be uniquely key because the opposition is always going to be better. In the status quo, we can modulate our military presence in the region to make sure that we can adequately respond to any developments in the South China Sea. Insofar as, that includes escalation by the Chinese military. Insofar as the government side is going to be denying us this possibility, that means that the opposition world is always going to be better. This observation, when conceded throughout the entirety of the round, it is a reason as why you ultimately vote for the opposition side. Even if you buy every single piece of offense coming out of the government side, even if you buy that we are isolating the situation, even if you are buying every single one of the arguments coming out of the trade war, insofar as the government is taking away one of our policy flexibility decisions in deciding how many forces we actually commit to this region, that means that the opposition world is always going to be better because we always have more flexibility in policy. Once again, this one conceded throughout the entire round. It's a reason as why the opposition is going to be winning regardless of which side wins the flow. But the second reason as why you ultimately vote for the opposition side is going to be the issue of benefiting the United States. Extend the framing coming out of the leader of the opposition case. This one conceded throughout the entire round. It is a reason as why we ultimately weigh the round under the criteria of the benefits to the United States. The only actual response that they actually kind of give is this value of stability. But once again, look towards the Chamberlain example. Remember, right before World War II, the Prime Minister of the UK, Neville Chamberlain, said yes to Hitler. You can annex about half of Austria because I think that it will provide peace in our time. Now look where that went us. It actually incentivized it incentivized Hitler to go and escalate World War II towards what it became, causing millions to die. The fact of the matter is that when you allow these leaders to go and escalate the situation, and when you reward them for it, they're simply going to be creating more and more perverse incentives. And this brings me to my main point. We have to go and benefit the United States first and foremost. There are four main reasons as why the opposition is winning this case. First of all, is that insofar they can see that China will get more power in the region if we are going to withdraw. Well, insofar as China is going to be getting more and more power in the region, that's always going to be worse for the United States because it gives our policymakers less and less ability to go and control that region for the benefit of the United States. That's always going to be worse for the United States people, which is already a reason to be voting for the opposition under the framing that went conceded throughout the last few speeches. But second of all, is going to be the issue of allied credibility. The only actual response that they give against this is that our allies already don't trust us, but insofar as we have the highest military in the world, that means that there will always be some level of credibility with our allies, especially considering our historical level of allied credibility. Insofar as the government side is going to be reducing our allied credibility, that is once again a reason as why you vote for the government side. Well, a reason as why you vote for the opposition side. Insofar as allied credibility is going to be going down, and insofar as we still have some allied credibility, that is still a reason as why you vote for the opposition side. But third is going to be the issue of economic control, because insofar as there is so much trade going through this region, that simply means that it's an issue of national security for that of the United States. We have to go and preserve our economy, which is yet another reason as why you ultimately vote for the opposition side. This is a reason as why you vote for the opposition side, because it's key towards making sure that we can preserve the interests of the United States. But fourth and finally is going to be this issue of perverse incentives, which one conceded throughout the entire round. Think of yourself as a Chinese policymaker. The fact of the matter is that if you are rewarded for escalating the situation, you are more likely to go and escalate the situation elsewhere, which is always going to be worse for the United States overall, both in the short term and in the long term, which means that that's yet another reason as why you ultimately vote for the opposition side. Once again, when conceded throughout the entire round. But the third and final voting issue is going to be the issue of solvency. The entirety of the government's case is built upon this idea that some other nation will fill in, but there is absolutely no reason whatsoever that any other nation will fill in. The United States has the largest military in the world, and the next two are Russia and China, who are plainly not going to be filling in towards the benefit of the rest of the international community, or towards the benefit of the United States in this reason. But second of all, remember that China is not going to be listening towards any other international agreements negotiated under the government side, because they are literally part of the UN Security Council. They can veto any agreement that they don't necessarily agree with. And third and finally is going to be the issue of chips on the board. The only actual way as to how we can actually resolve this situation in the long run via negotiation is if we actually have leverage against the Chinese, and the only way that we can actually do that is by preserving our military presence in the region. It is for these reasons that I urge an opposition ballot.
Okay. Comments? Judges ready? Cool. Off time, just going over 4 voting issues. Starting my time now. So the first voting issue is framework, and this is going to be really important because it's on definitions, which are essentially our opponents have nailed on this entire time. So with all cease all operations, and we talk about how we're essentially eliminating all stability without the entire region, but again, this isn't what the resolution says. The resolution says the South China Sea. This doesn't mean the entire East Asia region. This means that the U.S. still has bases in the Philippines, in Vietnam, in South Korea, in Japan. They still have this sphere of influence within East Asia. It's not like China's going to be able to be a big hegemon in East Asia without the U.S. being there. They just the conflict on the South China Sea is what we're focused on, because that specific conflict is manifesting into a physical conflict. We can see this with China actually reacting to the U.S. and actually deploying missiles, testing missiles, not just defense mechanisms, but actual offensive missiles towards the U.S. with essentially them flying planes over the South China Sea waters. So what we see here is this is really important because we're still going to have a sphere of influence. It's not like we're leaving East Asia all up and dry with no actual other actor other than China. And secondly, on the idea of stability, again, they talk about how stability isn't a good way to actually value this round, but it is. Again, it's not stability, it's appeasement if it's towards one's own one's own interests. You're not taking in the stability of the entire region if you're just looking for U.S. interests. This is why we see Hitler, for example. Hitler was only taking in his own interests. That's why it was appeasement of Chamberlain. This World War II example doesn't actually stand up because we see it's appeasement, not stability. We see that it's not Chamberlain looking for the stability of Europe as a region, but instead it was actually for his own self-interest within England. So what we see here is that the idea of stability doesn't actually doesn't actually stand if it's on the idea and the focus of the U.S. Domestic first, U.S. first idea and policy. You can only get stability if you look towards the entire region. So you can't actually get stability that impacts the fall within stability if you go with the NEG's framework. That's why you have to wash away the framework. Now onto the second voter of the U.S. being a bad actor and the importance of uniqueness in today's debate. Again, the NEG didn't prove why the U.S. is uniquely important militarily within the South China Sea. They say yes, they should be in the East Asia region, but we are in the East Asia region. We can see that with South Korea, Japan. We're still in the region and we still have a sphere of influence, but we're not within the conflict directly, which is really, really important. What we did instead is we made uniqueness of why the U.S. is bad in South China Sea conflict. We sourced Politico, CNN, Forbes, all of these talked about how the U.S. being there specifically makes China mad. China is mad because the U.S. is in the South China Sea. That is why China is escalating this, because the U.S. specifically, because they believe that the U.S. is essentially out to get China. What's important here is that we see that the U.S. has uniqueness of why this is bad within the South China Sea. We see the U.S. is uniquely bad within the South China Sea because of this. Instead, the NEG hasn't provided uniqueness of why the U.S. is the only actor that can do this. They say that it's going to be none or just the U.S. But again, they have disregarded the idea that the entire international community wants to be in this situation, but they can't because the U.S. is in it right now. We see France, UK, Canada, as they mentioned, all of these want to be within the situation to actually resolve this conflict, but they can't because the U.S. is in here. If the U.S. gets out, the international community is happy to take over this conflict. Essentially, with the whole ideal and ultimatum of U.S. or none, it's better to have none because the international community then has the availability to come in. They don't have the availability to come in if the U.S. is in there right now. So we see that the international community that can actually solve better is going to be in there because they're not specifically being hunted by the Chinese right now. The Chinese specifically want to actually create escalation for the U.S. specifically. Instead, if the international community is allowed to come in, then it allows for actual solvency of the issue. So we see that we have uniqueness here. But again, they also never responded to the fact that Trump lessens the credibility of the U.S. military and economy, which decreases the uniqueness of why the U.S. is a good actor in this region. We see that because Trump is the president right now, we see that it decreases the credibility of him being an actor and the U.S. being a good actor within this. So this actually is a turn in which the U.S. is a bad actor within the South China Sea conflict. We see that the international community is going to be better for this reason. On our third voter, which is the a priori argument, essentially you have to give links and evidence within California debate to actually have some credibility. Yes, we have reasonability in current events that we can use, but if you're going to cite things like international sea laws, you have to have actual evidence to do this. Otherwise, you can't vote on the opposition because they're not following the rules of debate in which one can believe the credibility of the other team. We cited CNN, Politico, Forbes. We cited multiple arguments within our entire case which gave us credibility so that you can believe what was actually happening influence in current events and to back it up with people who are actually experts on this topic. So we see that they can't actually win because of this. And our fourth is the economy. They talk about ally credibility, but allies that are dependent on the U.S. economy, if the U.S. economy fails because of this trade war that is escalated by this conflict, then the allies will have less credibility, or there'll be less ally credibility with the U.S. because the allies' economy is going to be hurt too. So we see this because this was essentially flowed through the entire debate. We see that these allies are going to be less credible towards the U.S. if the U.S. lets their economies fail. So for all of you, more is a strong vote in affirmation.
Alright, good round. Good round.
Good round.
Good round.
Good round.
Okay, then I'm gonna throw in mine. 'Cause
Okay, do I just tell you the result?
as soon as your ballot's filled out and submitted.
Okay, I haven't filled out my ballot, so.
You can add comments later, just submit your final and then you can add like comments.
Yeah.
Okay, got it.
Yeah.
I think that's what they were saying during the like announcements.
Mhm.
Yeah. So you can tell us as soon as you just like finally put in who won, and then you can like add whatever you want to say later.
Got it. Okay, cool. Wait, my ballot had errors. You go first.
Oh no.
I haven't finished it.
Okay.
When's the next round? 10:30.
Yeah, I think it's like 10:30.
It's probably a bit late though.
Yeah.
We started late.
Oh, 10:32. Cool.
Tied points are forbidden, apparently.
Tide points?
Yeah, so
Oh,
Speaker
yeah.
points?
Yeah, I can't give the same speaker point to more than one speaker.
What?
Wow, that's weird.
You can do it by 0.1 if
Yeah.
that helps.
Yeah, okay, cool.
Oh, great. We're hitting Lincoln. Oh, but we've debated them.
Yeah. We'll just have to find them in the like room. Let's see if they posted the topics. No, they haven't posted the topics for round 2. Oh, they made an
Oh,
announcement
no.
round 2 at 10:45.
Oh no, my family's
Okay,
here.
cool. Should I tell you guys my decision? I'll give you a little bit of the spiel because I do feel like it is valuable, although I'm going to be giving you all a detailed feedback on Tab Room. So I thought it was a very, very close debate, and for many reasons. I ended up having my vote go towards the negative team, and this is a very brief summary of it. I think the Gov team took on a lot more burden than you guys really should have, because here's the thing: when you say that you build your crux of the model around the fact that somebody is going to step in, right? I feel like you guys essentially took on the burden of 2 debates. One, which is the original debate of why we should pull out, and the second tier was this house believes that once US is pulled out, somebody's going to step in. These are 2 complete different mechanisms, right? The first thing I think could have been a really straightforward principle argumentation about like why we should respect the sovereignty of these nations, but second, the cost-benefit analysis, which you guys try to do. But then when you build the crux of your case around somebody's going to step in, look at China, look at Canada, UK, and the UN, it becomes your burden to give me the mechanism. That's a really hard mechanism, even as a college debater, to prove. And I feel like because you took on that and failed to do so, it gave a lot of room for Nick team to say, look, like, it was never proven. We don't know who's going to step in. US is obviously not the best actor. I think we all agree on that. But then at least it's the most capable actor. US is the only government that's dumb enough to spend so much money in terms of like splurging on military bases. No other country has even come close to that, right? So I think that point, because you guys took on it, I did flow it, and because it ended up becoming a major clash in this debate, that's what pushed the negative team over. And I think this whole thing about like the Cali Parley rules, I thought it kind of worked both ways. Both of you guys made claims that were both credible as well as incredible. So I think really no team was at a disadvantage for that. Yeah, the rest of the comment, I will definitely give you all individual feedback on Tableau. Make sure you read it. Go for it.
Yeah, I also went with the neg, and because the burden of proof for me is on the AF side, and I agree the Cali rules were less relevant to me than making a persuasive argument based on common knowledge or reasonability. So I think that was an excellent point. I think the Neville Chamberlain is an excellent argument. So I think you guys did an excellent job at harping on that, and I think that that's a completely fair point. And this is a complex issue, right? And each of you could have done a better job at articulating the complexity. It's not economic or military, even though you want to make it that, or make the resolution that it's actually more complex. Each of these things is a chess piece in the larger game, and you didn't all exactly say that in a way that shows the complexity in the argument that's necessary, right? Because each of these things is a move. You can't just look at the South China Sea. You have to look at it, everything in its totality. So those are my main reasons. I'll provide some notes on tab room, by the end of the day.
I think one way. Sorry for cutting you off. One way that Gov or AF, okay. One way that AF team could have won is to have given me a mechanism of why this escalates tension. Because I think the point where you stop is, we have military there, they feel threatened, so there's going to be tension. Yeah, intuitively that makes sense. But if you were to give me reasons as to how that exactly happens, what kind of incentives China has in order to push back violently, I think I would have bought your case. Because, for example, the trade war already happening, obviously China is definitely looking to take the international hegemony. That's great. I think everyone knows that in this room. Give me the mechanism. Why is this already acting as the final push that China needed to be more aggressive and perhaps cause a war? Perhaps do more interventions in places like Philippines, and the Philippines has already sort of fought back, right? So that mechanism is kind of missing.
Okay.
But good claim though. Alright, good luck guys.
Thank you. Great. Thank you so much.
That's yours, right?
Yeah. Good luck in the rest of your rounds and have a great weekend. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
5 more rounds today. Only one.
Yeah.
Hey, come on, we're hitting the number one hitters in the country.
Thanks for judging.
Thank you.
Do we already have to go somewhere else?
Yes. Thanks.
Oh, no worries. Thank you too. That was actually a pretty decent round.
It was decent. You need anything? You good?
No.
Oh, we have to hit stop.
Yeah, that's true. Just leave it there. I'll try to take it to Joel.
Doesn't stop. Oh, I see.